Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this Sustainable Gambling Conference 2019. This is the fourth edition of this conference. Last year it was held in Stockholm, and 2 times before that in Malta. Today it's such a pleasure to welcome you all here in Copenhagen, a rainy Copenhagen. I apologize for that. Today we are going to have an exciting and important day ahead of us. We are going to discuss how the gambling industry can build more relevance in society and how we can work together to secure a sustainable gambling industry. We have together here gathered a lot of bright minds to give us more knowledge about how we raise the bar together. Among you here in the room, we have leading academics, we have psychologists, researchers, gambling operators, regulators, and treatment agencies. And together, from different angles, we will put some words on the theme of this conference, building relevance. Words that describes how the online gambling industry can improve their relevance and add value in the wider community through sustainable partnerships, communications, and marketing. We will do that by listening to some great speakers here from this stage, and we will involve all of you during the Q&As and the panel discussions. I will come back to that later. But first, I will walk over here, because over here we have a white canvas, and we have Karen. Good morning. Maybe I use this one now. Yes? Karen, you are can anybody hear me? You are an illustrator. Yes. You are going to draw the day. How?
First of all, I need to listen very, very carefully to everything that is going to be concluded. And so I'm going to make a visual resume of the day. Some of you might have seen me before in Malta. I was part of that event as well. And please, I want to say that please feel free to come up and look at what I'm doing and also comment on it. If there's a point that you really think needs to be on this canvas, feel free to come up and talk to me.
And you will be here all day long,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Thank you, Karen. There will also be some other, let me call them illustrators. We have a photographer over here, and she will take pictures all during the day. And these pictures, can I put this one down? Yes. These pictures will be used for communication material around this conference. So if you don't want to be on those pictures, please just tell the photograph. Can you raise your hand so everybody can see you? Yes. If you don't want to be on those photos, just tell her. And then I think it's time to welcome the first man on stage, CEO in Kindred Group, Henrik Tjärnström. Good morning, Henrik.
Good morning. Good
Have
morning.
a seat.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to Copenhagen.
Thank you very much.
Because this conference takes place in different locations.
Yes.
Why?
Yeah, the first 2 years we were in Malta, and it was about the responsible gambling conference, as it was called back then. And of course, that's a very key topic for us in our industry. But our footprint on society is so much more than just responsible gambling. So we wanted to really touch on all those touch points that we have and how we interact with society across. And then we also felt that it's also better done to also go across to different territories where we have different expertise and knowledge and everything. And we also where we have activity as operators. So last year we were in Stockholm, which was really good. First time out of Malta, and this year is Copenhagen.
And it's the 4th edition, as I said before. Why is it important to keep hosting this conference?
I think it's extremely important because as I said, our impact on society is quite wide. It's the first instinct is perhaps that it's responsible gambling, and that's the big topic. And of course, that's extremely important and something that we work extremely hard to address. But we also have a lot of other positive aspects as an industry as well when it comes to interaction with communities and with sponsorships and marketing, and also the vast majority of citizens enjoy gambling as a pastime entertainment experience. And that's also important not to forget in a sense. So it's a really important topic, and that's why we've changed the name to Sustainable Gambling Conference as well. So we try to capture the whole aspect of our impact on society.
And the gambling industry is growing. Do you actually think it's more important to have this conference today than 4 years ago?
I think it is, and it's also what we've seen with the trend that regulation is spreading across our different territories and across Europe especially, and now US is opening up as well as a potential new market, or many new markets for us as operators. I think that's putting the topic at the forefront of people's perception and the dialogue and the discussion in society in general. We see discussions about potential marketing bans and stuff like that, which we strongly oppose, and we don't think that we think it's very counterproductive to talk about things like that. So to have the open dialogue and discussion, and also hearing it from different sides and different angles, I think is extremely important for us as an industry, and we have so many different stakeholders around us as operators as well.
And if we look back at the conference in Stockholm last year, the theme was collaboration to improve. Can you elaborate a bit on that theme?
Yeah, no, as I said, we of course have a big footprint on society, but and we appreciate that whilst we bring positive aspects, we also have some more challenging areas like responsible gambling. And as we have made big improvements as operators across the industry, we also can't do this alone, and that's why we really want to have these conferences where we can invite leading researchers and treatment practices and scientists to really come with fact-based and looking at things from a scientific perspective and see how that can be. And it's through collaboration that we can really make the difference. And that's what we wanted to emphasize last year, that it's a collaboration to improve, that we need to do this together.
And this year is building relevance.
Yeah.
How do you want this industry to be more relevant?
I think it's about the footprint we have, and also using the technology to its full potential and seeing how we can apply the leading researchers' studies and outcomes into our business and how we operate, and really see how that can be sort of transferred into the customer experience and how the customers perceive it. So I think it's about sort of finding the common grounds and the ways to improve, and also how we can become more relevant as an industry.
And when we talk about the gambling industry, I come to think about perception. This perception of your industry is quite poor. How does that concern you?
Yeah, I'm probably quite biased, but I think it's been extremely sort of overly criticized as an industry, and I think it's so much focusing on the negative aspects, which again we have to face up to, and we have to address that as well. And I can take on board as Kindred that we can be even better in sort of explaining what the positive impacts we have on society and how that interacts. But I think it's also about kind of taking that to the next level and seeing how we can really improve the perception, because we do a lot of good things in society as well. And I think the first kind of negative perception people have might be that's the perception that we feed off problem gamblers. And yes, we have gamblers that play for a higher level than others.
Are they wrong?
Yeah, but it is not the level of gambling that's the critical issue here. It's about the patterns in the gambling behavior, and how we can see that what a customer actually can afford to play for, and how we can interact and how we can apply the latest technology to really make sure that it becomes through as an entertainment value. And of course, if the sort of the customer experience and the duty of care and the consumer protections is at risk, then of course we have to act on that, and that's our responsibility.
So what I hear you say is that you don't think that this poor perception is fair.
I think it's fair to some extent, and I think we can be a lot better at explaining how we could be a net contributor to society, which is a key aspect of us as an industry. But I think it's also important to look at it in amongst other sectors in society as well. And I think it's from a politician's point of view, it's sometimes perhaps a little bit easy to go after the sector and not looking at the positive aspects like sponsorships and bringing sort of our expertise and knowledge into local communities as well across, and actually are a net contributor to society.
So if you take what do you see as the absolute key points if you are going to change this perception?
Yeah, we have to be more transparent, and it has to be fact-based as well. And we also need to show through examples on what we do. We ourselves, as Kindred, has published now our sustainable annual report for sustainability report 2 years running now, and where we're trying to really highlight the topics on how we work with sustainability and responsible gambling and all the different aspects, and how we are becoming a net contributor to society. And we do a lot of partnerships. For example, this year we have done through the cooperation in Derby County on the mental health campaign. We also do with the Epic Risk Solution in Belgium when it's teaching Belgian clubs about the responsible gambling. We're also working with the Football Development Network to really see and educate clubs around responsible gambling. So we're doing a lot of local stuff, and in Sweden we've done the 30/30 Foundation with Henrik Lundqvist, an ice hockey star in the US. And we also will be sponsoring in Sweden the Swedish elite football for next year. So it's a lot of different things that we actually do, and we want to portray those as well.
But are you good enough to tell these stories?
Yeah, it's a good step in the right direction. It has to start somewhere, and I think that's where we have to gradually sort of address these issues and be open and transparent. And I think it's only through that we can actually, over time, convince people that this is good. It is not bad for society.
And you talked about the politicians before. I just want to mention this because last week the Danish EU politician Søren Gade opened the debates about TV commercials from the gambling industry. He started to begin with, he mentioned it, and then now he wants to ban it totally. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I can understand that there's a fatigue in society around marketing in general. I don't think it's necessarily isolated to gambling. It's from time to time when there's a certain sector that are more prominent than others, and of course it becomes a bit of fatigue. But I think it's extremely counterproductive to talk about bans, because we have to remember that as a digital service where we are in, the alternative is just one click away. And if the customer can find that, then if any restrictions for the regulated operators in the local markets, that would just be to the benefit of operators who have not got a local license, and that's to the detriment of society. And also, as I mentioned, when we're doing so many good campaigns and also sponsorships across, I think that's also an important aspect to remember, that those things would also be harmed if you do a blanket ban. So I think it's extremely counterproductive for the local initiatives and channelization.
But how do you see your responsibility as an operator?
I think it's about what we say. We need to take more responsibility. We need to be clear on what we do and how we work, and be transparent. And that's what we have done, for example, in Sweden now, after the re-regulation in Sweden from 1st January last year, or this year. We have changed our communication campaigns a lot more towards responsible gambling and play responsibly. And again, with the 30/30 Foundation with Henrik Lundqvist is a good example, where we dedicate commercials on TV solely to the responsible gambling sort of discussion.
Is that possible?
It is, yeah. And we see good uptake from the customers as well, and good feedback on those commercials, that it's taking the problem seriously.
What have you done since last year to build more relevance in society?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we have done a lot of things through our local team as Kindred as an operator, and then of course we also work through our trade associations across the different markets, and EGB in Brussels as well. So we're trying to be really at a broad footprint on initiatives that we do, and some of the things that our local teams has done, as I mentioned, is a mental health campaign in Derby County that we've done. We also offer some of the church sponsorship areas for safe play. And as I mentioned, also on the Football Development Network, we have done partnerships to educate on responsible gambling, and as I mentioned in Belgium, also regarding the problem, sort of the anti-match fixing and stuff like that with the Football Development Network. So it is a lot of things that we do, and again, with the Swedish elite football sponsorship from next year in Sweden, that's the most prized asset for sponsorship in Sweden in sports ever. And that's going to be a big, bold step that we're going to do, and now it's for us to show our sort of intent with that one as well from next year. So it's a lot of good stuff, but of course we can do more, and we will as well.
Yes, because I was going to ask you if you think you do enough.
We can always do more. That's no problem with that. There's an ever.
Then let me go further to the next question. How do you see the modern gambling industry transforming in the future?
I think we have a lot of things going in our favor. I think we have the technological advancements that we've seen in society over the last 20 years when we've been operating has been huge. And now when we see technology and we can use that to its full potential, I'm convinced that we can eradicate what we see as pathological gambling behavior in the coming years. And I think that's clearly doable. But of course, we need to cooperate as well, and we need to be able to take in what leading researchers and scientists and treatment practices are bringing as studies and incorporate that into our ways of working and our things to do. So to make sure about that. But I'm convinced that we can be part of the solution, not the problem, in the future as well. And I think it's a huge opportunity we have, and really using the technology to its full potential.
And one last question, what are your expectations from this conference today?
I think it's a great opportunity for all of us to as a sort of stakeholders in our industry to meet up and have a good and broad dialogue and discussion, and also as said here from the recent news from leading scientists and researchers and treatment practices as well, and have an open and broad dialogue, and of course if we can ensure that sort of it's a fair play and level playing field for all operators, and that we can really make sure that we all push forward towards more sustainable gambling. That's of course the end goal.
This be the last word. Thank you so much, Henrik.
Thank you very much.
As I said before, you all have the opportunity to participate today when we go through the Q&As and the panel discussions. And who you have been taking part in this conference earlier already know the tool called Menti, because it is one of the tools today you can use. Everybody find your smartphone. We are a lot of new ones today, so we will try this tool. It's called Mentimeter, and you will find it if you open the internet browser and go to menti.com. And when you enter the website, you have to use a code. Can we have the slide back with the code on? Because I don't know if anybody saw it. It's in the top, thank you. And then you have different possibilities. There is a multiple choice, and I can see that some of you is already using it, because here you have to enter what type of organization you represent today. And of course, we can see that we have a lot of operators in the room. Almost half of you as an operator. Thank you. And then let's try another one. It's called a word cloud. And in this one, I want you to tell me, where do you come from? I see you get it. I get it too. Perfect. And we have a lot of cities and countries represented here today. Thank you so much. After the two next speakers, we will sum up with a Q&A. And here we will have Henrik Stjernström represented, and also the two next speakers. And if you already now have a question for Henrik, you can push it through Menti. And talking about speakers, let me go to the next one. He's a man. He is a psychologist and a professor who is specialized in behavioral addiction at Nottingham Trent University, and who adds important science and research to develop tools to understand and tackle the area of problem gambling. Today he will talk about his research that explains advertisement's effect on problem gambling. Please welcome on this kindred stage, once again, Mark Griffith.
Whoa.
Oh, take care. Do you need a hand?
That's my fault for bringing a glass of water up with me. Whoops.
Do you need a hand?
Whoop, I'll get
Oh,
there
it's
in a minute.
okay. This one is for your slides.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry, that's not the worst thing I did. I once came on stage and tripped over a wire and fell over completely. So, another time, I wear glasses now, but I used to wear contact lenses. And one talk, my contact lens fell out while I was doing the talk, and I was literally trying to put it in while I was talking at the same time. And I finally put it back in. I got this spontaneous round of applause. And somebody came up to me after and said, you know, when your contact was in the palm of your hand, you had the audience there with you as well. Anyway, so I've got about 45 minutes today to talk about psychology and, the psychology of gambling and advertising. My title there is slightly different from the one in the program, but it's basically going to cover the same kind of things. Those of you who were here last year, I gave a talk on in-play betting and the psychology of gambling advertising. I've got about 60 slides today, and for those of you here that were here last year, I think 12 of those are repeated from last year, so 1/5 of my presentation today is not new. If you don't remember the slides I put up last year, you're either asleep or I didn't obviously keep you entertained for long enough. But what I'm going to try and do today, I'm going to try and look at some of the perceived concerns about gambling advertising. I'm going to look very briefly at some of the academic views on gambling advertising. I'm going to spend hopefully about 10 minutes talking about what I perceive to be is irresponsible gambling advertising. And a lot of the examples I'm going to show you actually rely on humor. I mean, humor is one of the things that the gambling industry use all the time across all different types of gambling advertising. Some of the adverts I put up today, they are both funny but also very socially irresponsible at the same time. So I'm going to do that. Then I'm going to talk a bit about some of the research that I've been doing over the last 2 years particularly and tie it into 2 reviews that myself and Elizabeth Killick have just written. So we've just done a systematic review of sports betting advertising and the effect on people's behavior, and we've also done a systematic review looking at all those studies that have content analyzed sports betting adverts as well. That actually is, these have all been done over the kind of last about 8 years or so, and actually there's only 23 of these studies, so I'm going to talk about the main findings from some of that. And then I'm going to have a couple of slides where I talk about what I think socially responsible gambling operators should be doing, and then just wrap it up with a few conclusions. Okay, so there's obviously been lots and lots of speculation over the years about the role of marketing and advertising and its effect on gambling and whether it actually contributes to problem gambling. Now, one thing I'm going to say now, and I'll be saying it again in my last slide, there is actually no definitive proof whatsoever from an empirical or scientific perspective that actually says that gambling advertising causes problem gambling. We know that some studies have associated problem gambling with advertising, but there is no scientific research that says that gambling advertising causes problem gambling. But you could say that with a lot of things. So, for instance, there's nothing, we know, for instance, that slot machines are highly associated with problem gambling, but as far as I know, there is no research definitively showing that slot machines cause problem gambling, only that there's a high association there. Obviously, we have lots of lobby groups, and I can think in England where we've got particular religious groups, for instance, who claim that advertising plays a kind of widespread role in the acceptance of gambling. And I've got, anyone that knows me knows I'm not anti-gambling, and I'm certainly not anti-advertising or anti-marketing. What I am is pro-gambling and pro-responsible marketing, pro-responsible advertising when it comes to the gambling industry. Obviously, lots of people, particularly lobby groups and other stakeholders, will say that the way that advertising and marketing is used is that we use glamorous, glitzy people to advertise gambling. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If you're focusing on the entertainment, okay, that is absolutely fine as far as I'm concerned as a psychologist. But obviously, one question that comes up again and again and again is that does advertising create these kind of unrealistic hopes of winning that may actually trigger problem gambling? So when we look at, okay, I think these next few slides are, if you like, the most boring slides I'm going to put up, even though I'm an academic, and I just noticed I'm I'm just among the 3% of academics who are here today. But 2 of my colleagues, Simon Plantzer and Heather Wardle, Heather I've written a lot with over the years, but they wrote a really good paper back in 2012. And they said that if demonstrating a link between advertising and a sale is complex, demonstrating a link advertising and a broader gambling behavior is even more so. And I think that's the problem we've got. Every single study that's been done to date has always been what I call kind of cross-sectional snapshot research. Even if we were able to do some kind of longitudinal study, there'd be so many confounding factors that I don't actually ever think we'll ever come up with a study that actually would actually show that gambling advertising and gambling marketing causes or has a major effect on problem gambling. Again, if you look at the kind of psychological literature as a whole, over the last 20 years, particularly in places like Australia and Canada, they've done content analytic research looking at the content of what happens in marketing and advertising. And what you see is that gambling is portrayed as normal, enjoyable form of entertainment involving fun and excitement. And again, from my perspective, there's nothing wrong with that. You certainly wouldn't want to be selling gambling as anything other than that. People find it bizarre I was a professor of gambling studies for 15 years, and people find it very bizarre that I like playing roulette, that I like sports betting. The point about gambling is it is fun and exciting, and there is no harm in actually promoting those aspects of gambling per se. Some researchers, particularly again in Australia, have said that a large number of gambling adverts are misleading. And again, in some of the content analytic research that we've done more recently within the sports betting arena, I would argue that that is the case with some adverts, but certainly not all adverts. Again, Canadian research has shown that gambling adverts are often centered on friends and social entertainment. And again, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. Again, when I go gambling, I like to go gambling with friends. When I'm playing roulette, I'd rather be doing it with people around me that I know rather than on my own. Some people have argued that the kind of media gambling exposure leads to positive attitudes towards gambling, and the effects of media gambling exposure are stronger than the kind of counter-advertising effects of media exposure. And again, I'll investigate some of those claims more thoroughly a bit later on. In terms of reviews on gambling, there have now been a lot done around the world. Per Bind in Sweden, I think he's the kind of guru of gambling and advertising research, and he's consistent. If you ever read one of his reviews, they are balanced, they are measured. They really put the empirical evidence at the heart of it. So most of the research that's been done, particularly if you take away the content analytic studies, most of the research is what I would call attitudinal research. It's asking people about what they actually think about gambling, what effect do they think it has on their particular behavior. And again, there's a real problem with any kind of self-report research because people will give you socially desirable answers. People will have memory recall issues. I think what's interesting now in the gambling field is that, particularly in Australia, they're now using this kind of ecological techniques in gambling where you're actually being targeted maybe 6 or 7 times a day to ask you about what's happening in terms of gambling, what adverts have you seen, has that had any effect on your behavior, rather than doing the kind of traditional questionnaires and surveys that people like me have been using for the last 30 years. There's actually very little of these data actually talks about the insight between the relationship between advertising and gambling behavior. Looking at directly how gambling affects behavior, apart from asking people what they think about that, it's very hard to say. It's been traditionally very hard to investigate. Advertising is one of those things. Again, I was going to put up a slide, and it's a slide that I put up in a lot of my talks where I talk about the kind of main influencing factors of gambling. We talk about the individual factors, we talk about the structural factors, and we talk about the situational factors. When we talk about advertising, advertising is one of these macro situational factors. These are things that get people to gamble in the first place. They are what we call an acquisitional factor. So when we think about marketing and advertising, where we place our products, where we place it within a geographical location, these are situational characteristics, but it's a very, very small part of a very, very large jigsaw. So even though advertising and marketing is very important, it's certainly very important in terms of the amount that the industry spend on gambling, is that when we look at gambling as a whole, gambling is a complex behavior, and as I say, even when you just look at the individual factors, whether it's a person's own biological or genetic predisposition, their personality factors, their attitudes, their expectations, the social environment they live in, and then you add in the structural characteristics, the jackpot sizes, the stakes, the event frequency, the near misses, and then you add in all the marketing and the advertising, this is just such a small part of a very, very big, large jigsaw. Now again, going back to, as I say, what I think was a very good paper by Heather Wardle and Simon Plantzer, they also said that if we think about what advertising actually does, they basically made a supposition that gambling advertising might actually work by triggering consumption among at-risk or problem gamblers and altering how gambling is perceived within particular population groups. As I said right at the start, on the whole, research has not found that gambling advertising plays a role in actually motivating people to start gambling. And in fact, a lot of people talk about what gambling advertising is doing, and it's a bit like the tobacco industry, really. Is that what they'll say is that we're using our advertising to take gamblers from away from other operators and to bring them to ours. And again, I think Henrik made a very good point. Is that if you ban gambling advertising, okay, the effect of that, of course, is that you get a lot of, say, unregulated operators who don't have social responsibility, responsible gambling, player protection, harm minimization at the core of what they do. You know, what you want, of course, is your gamblers to come to a gambling operator that's got an infrastructure to help players that might develop problems. You don't want them to be playing with operators that really don't give two monkeys about their duty of care. So again, advertising and marketing can actually play a good role in getting people to come to those responsible operators in the first place. And again, something where I might disagree slightly with Henrik, is that I don't believe you'll ever eliminate problem gambling. I think we can minimize it and we can, get it down to very, very low levels, but we will never, ever eliminate it. There will always be problem gambling. It doesn't matter if you ban something, whether it's problem drinking, problem gambling, is that it will always be around. But I do think lots of the measures that we're using now to try and minimize it, that is the best that we can hope for. Evidence also suggests that advertising encourages an increase in gambling amongst those who are already gamblers. And again, what we see, lots of the research, it actually goes to regular gamblers and problem gamblers and asks them what they thought advertising played in their journey from being a non-gambler through to a regular or a problem gambler. It's also been argued that advertising, the advertising of gambling during a sports match has the aim of encouraging impulse bets. In the UK, for instance, at the moment, the Gambling Commission are now saying we don't want adverts that say bet now. They're saying that these are, border on being socially irresponsible. Yes, tell people what the odds of winning on a particular thing, but don't get into this idea that people should be gambling now on the spot when they see an advert. And there is a lot of that kind of impulse-type gambling advertising that we're seeing, particularly related to in-play betting, which I talked about last year at this year's conference. Obviously, once placed, the results, the results in the gambler's emotional attach. I know for there was a strap line. I can't remember which gambling company it was, but it says it matters more if there's money on it. And again, I know that when I've got a little bet on a football match, it does actually make watching that football match far more exciting. We know from research that males are slightly more likely to recall seeing gambling advertising than women, but actually it's not, if you look at the research, it's not statistically significant difference, but males do tend to have a higher recall of gambling advertising. And we know that some advertising characteristics that are, so for instance, adverts that are sexually provocative, and I'll talk about a few of those a bit later on when I talk about irresponsible advertising, is that they appeal far more to men, which is probably not surprising at all. This particular study, which I did briefly mention last year, of all the studies that I've done, this is probably the one I'm most proud of. This is probably the largest study that's looked at gambling and the effects of advertising on gambling, and I did this with some of my Norwegian colleagues at the University of Bergen. In this study, we had over 6,000 people that took part. This was actually the first study to investigate the perceived advertising impacts in a sample of a large-scale sample of gamblers drawn from the general population across lots of different cohorts, lots of different subgroups. What we found was that younger males seemed to be far more susceptible to gambling advertising, that problem gamblers, they were significantly more likely to say that advertising increased their own gambling involvement. We also controlled for the amount of gambling exposure, and we found that the exposure was not an effect. And what I like about this paper, this is one of the few papers that I've actually published where the title actually sums up the whole paper, and it says that the impact of gambling advertising problem gamblers report stronger impacts on involvement, knowledge and awareness than recreational gamblers. Some of you out there might think, well, isn't that common sense? But again, sometimes in psychology we find a lot of counterintuitive findings. But as I say, this was done on a large-scale survey. Although it wasn't quite nationally representative, we think it was about as representative we could have done for the amount of money that it took to fund this particular study. Okay, this next portion of my talk, this is probably a bit more frivolous. Okay, so I'm going to talk in this section more about kind of what I consider to be irresponsible gambling. So what I've got here, and again, I think I may have put this slide up last year. These are taken from real gambling adverts. Okay, so here we've got things like saying winning is easy. It might as well be you. Win a truckload of cash. Play by your rules. Spend for the rest of your life. Win 1 million. The fewer numbers you choose, the easier it is to win. It's easy to win. $600,000 giveaway simply by inserting your card into the machine. Wins are multiplying like bunnies. So, I mean, all I'm trying to get, these are just things that I've taken from adverts. And again, the kind of standard gambling industry response is things like, well, we're selling fantasies and dreams. Everybody knows that the claims that we make in adverts, that they're going to be excessive. Big claims are made to catch people's attention. People don't really believe what they see in advertisements. Business advertising does not obviously necessarily emphasize the negative aspects of the products. But does that make it right? Well, I think what we've seen over the last 10 years, and I think regulators all around the world now, is that they're now, I think in most mature markets, you would say that there is a tolerance of gambling advertising and marketing. We've seen places like Italy that have decided to ban gambling advertising. Personally, I do think that's a retrograde step, unless you've got conclusive proof that that is actually going to have an effect in terms of minimizing problem gambling. So what we've got now, of course, is some sectors of the industry and some particular companies, and I'm going to, I always kind of single out Paddy Power on this, because Paddy Power, I think, are the kings of irresponsible gambling advertising. And now I work with Paddy Power, and I've worked with their responsible gambling department, but that, sometimes their marketing department has very little to do with what the responsible gambling department is doing. But again, if we look at the types of irresponsible gambling advertising that are out there, we know that there are adverts out there that do seem to be attractive to children. There are adverts out there that we know that use sex to sell gambling. We know that there are adverts out there that claim that gambling can solve all your financial problems and solve your psychological problems. And again, I haven't got the advert up today, but I think it was the French company Partouche. Their strap line was "Bet to forget." And again, to me, this is socially irresponsible. The idea that you should to gamble just to forget about all your other problems is not a good way to be marketing and advertising your product. We've also seen adverts that, where you've got gambling in the workplace. Again, for me, this is socially irresponsible. Adverts that imply there's lots of skill in gambling. We know there are types of gambling like poker, like blackjack. You could argue even some types of sports betting may involve a small level of skill. But again, you find that some adverts are really emphasizing the skill over everything else. Again, these border on being socially irresponsible. We've got adverts that you could argue are promoting excessive gambling, and you've got adverts that cause offense to particular subsections of society. They might be sexist, heterosexist, homophobic, racist, and I'm going to give some examples of these. So again, one of the things I would always say is that you should never have adverts that are in any way appealing to children. So here is Poker Stars, Jack and the Beanstalk. Again, this kind of cartoon kind of character. I personally would see this as something as being socially irresponsible. Again, this is a slide I put up last year when the first Facebook gambling game came into existence in August 2012, a game called Bingo Frenzy. I mean, all their advertising was, this kind of cartoon, childlike figures. Again, at the time when this came out, my son at the time was very much into something called Moshi Monsters, and these Moshi Monsters were very, very similar to the images that you saw in the advertising for Bingo Frenzy. Again, in the UK, and a lot of the examples I'm going to give today come from the UK, we know that the operator Camelot, who I've worked with ever since they came into existence in 1994, I mean, one thing that I've constantly told them is that they sometimes walk that tightrope. Camelot have, if you look at their kind of responsibility guidelines, they say that we will never have a product that is in any way attractive to children. Okay, now if you actually say that and then you do things that contravene that, then people like myself are going to criticize Camelot for that. Now I know they're doing less and less of this type of thing. So here's an example. So we've got Connect 4, which is obviously a game that children do play. Pac-Man. I mean, I don't know how many adults play Pac-Man, but my guess is it's not that many compared to children. Although having said that, when I did talk to Camelot about this, they said, well, you know, none of the kids know today what Pac-Man was. It's only the adults like myself who was playing them on arcade games 30 years ago that will remember this. However, you know, Camelot do use what we call the psychology of familiarity all the time. You know, when I think about how they've, you know, got their licensing to have scratch cards related to things like Lord of the Rings, related to Star Wars, related to James Bond, these are things that do appeal to children. Now, the one on the far left, you know, my son at the time, I mean, he's 18 now, but at the time, he was mad on Lord of the Rings, and he absolutely loved Legolas. And I bought this card for him. You know, not that he wanted to play the scratch games, but he wanted, you know, this Lord of the Rings card. And you know, he had this up on his bedroom wall for quite a while. I'm sure he didn't really know what, you know, the actual card was and the function of it, but these are attractive to children. Obviously, now, can I just say, I could have put lots worse examples up here in terms of how sex is used to sell gambling. You find a lot of particularly online casinos which basically have naked women. I mean, I've put here what I would call scantily clad examples here, but you know, using sex as a way to sell gambling for me is a socially irresponsible thing to do. Now, as I say, I'm going to come now to a whole series of Paddy Power adverts. Now, again, this was an advert that was to get women to go to bingo. Now, I'd say, to be honest, that this advert I don't think actually contravenes any particular guideline. Whether you think it's socially responsible or not, I don't know. But for me, I don't necessarily think this is socially responsible. I find this more funny than anything else. But I think some of the adverts I'm going to show now, I think, are socially irresponsible. So this one, let's make things more interesting. This is not the worst examples, by the way. So orange is the new black. We're now paying out. So Paddy Power actually started paying out on Donald Trump. They started paying out on Hillary, I think, before Trump ever entered the White House. Always bet on black. So you might have seen the recent fight between Conor McGregor, the UFC fighter, versus Mayweather, and of course, you know, all the money was on Mayweather. You know, and there's the idea that, you know, we know that a boxer is going to win a boxing event rather than somebody that's a UFC fighter. Here are 3 adverts which I think are all really irresponsible. I mean, on the left here, we've got the Oscar Pistorius case. So this was actually around the same time as the Oscars was taking place. So, you know, money back if he walks. The top right here, so this was during our last general election. So this was some odds on Nigel Farage, who at the time was at UKIP, and Nick Clegg of the Liberal Party, and who is the best masturbator. And then bottom right here, which again, I think this is really irresponsible. Some people in the room may not know who this person is at the bottom right. This is a guy called Rolf Harris, who's a children's entertainer who is now a convicted paedophile. Okay, and this was used to advertise our Ashes cricket. Now again, I don't know how many people follow cricket in here, but obviously we always have a big grudge match between Australia and England, and obviously in cricket we want to get people out, but the catchphrase here was the only Australian we don't want out, and this meant out of prison, was Rolf Harris. Now this is, for me, a hugely sexist advert. Okay, so a woman's place is in the house, so we're paying out early on Hillary Clinton to win, so obviously the bookmakers or Paddy Power lost money there. This is one of the most socially irresponsible adverts that I've seen in the UK. You know, you should never be using gambling advertising as a way to solve your financial problems. So when you've got mortgage, what mortgage? Okay, to me, this is totally socially irresponsible. Then I thought what I'd do is actually look at some of the adverts that we have banned in the UK and beyond. So again, you know, as I mentioned already, is that there is now a big kind of push now, is that the adverts that say bet now, these kind of impulse gambling adverts should be at least monitored and possibly banned. Obviously, we've got, you know, examples of where the Advertising Standards Authority or the Gambling Commission have said we're going to ban these ads because they do not conform to our guidelines. So again, I could have given you loads and loads of examples where games have been banned because they're perceived to be attractive to children. So this is one that uses the Monopoly game. This one was from a children's Looney Tunes app, and we had 4 gambling operators who were advertising and marketing via this particular site. Now, does anyone know? Now, this advert was banned. Anyone? want to shout out why this advert might have been banned. Money back if Luis Suarez scores. Any idea? No? Well, this was banned because Luis Suarez at the time was 24 years old, and we have a kind of thing that we don't ever have anybody that's under 25 in an advert. Now, I think with Luis Suarez, to me, he doesn't really look young or childlike there. I think there are examples where so for instance, this is a very recent one. So Jadon Sanchez, the Borussia Dortmund player who plays for England. I mean, he's a teenager, and here he is being used in advertising for the new football index. Another one, Anthony Martial of Manchester United. Again, another very young player. So Ladbrokes had their advert banned with him in the UK. Again, we've now got this push that young celebrities shouldn't be used in adverts. I mean, this one here, people won't even know. I recognise the person that they're referring to. It's a woman called Fleur East who appeared on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and was being used in some of the gambling marketing campaigns in the UK, saying that this is something that glamorises gambling. That here's somebody that, at least for her 15 minutes of fame, was up there and being used and should be banned. We've seen adverts banned for, say, gambling linked to things like sexual seduction. This was actually a TV ad. I won't actually be showing any of the ads today. These are just still shots from some of those ads. There's actually something on the web. There's an article called the 10 most infamous examples of gambling adverts being banned. At number 8 here, we had the sexy croupier advert that was used by William Hill back in 2013. VGA.com, they were heavily slammed for linking gambling to financial security. Here was an advert here that promoted gambling. We had an advert where a bored security guard was caught gambling, or rather was gambling via his mobile phone while he was bored at work on a Paddy Power game. So again, this was banned for supposedly normalising gambling at work. Poker stars, they were banned for what they called was a socially irresponsible advert, where if you just read at the bottom here, it says it's been banned. The ad was banned for exploiting inexperienced poker players and suggesting that they could generalise large winnings from the game of bluffing. This particular campaign. Now, as a psychologist, I love typologies. I think of all the papers I've published over the years, psychologists love to put people into the boxes. Ladbrokes had what they called their life campaign, where they had 5 different types of gambler, and 2 of these were seen as socially irresponsible. The professor, whose strapline was once his lucky, twice his talent, and Mr. Brightside was also criticised. So when you win, it's skill, and when you lose, it's bad luck. So these kind of messages that were being, and this was a big TV campaign and a big press campaign, social media campaign, but was heavily slammed at the time for being socially irresponsible. One of the most recent ones, okay, many of you may even recognise that person in the picture. This is Rodri Giggs. Now, Rodri Giggs is the brother of Ryan Giggs, who is now the Wales manager and the ex-Manchester United footballer. Ryan Giggs had an affair with his brother's wife for 8 years. Okay, so his brother was obviously very disloyal towards the family, and they brought in this strapline, loyalty's dead, live for rewards. But in fact, this advert was banned. If you actually watch the 1-minute advert, okay, right through it totally glamorizes gambling. There's lots of champagne involved, lots of winning money, etc. And Rodri Giggs is now one of the ambassadors for Paddy Power. But as I say, it says at the bottom there, the ad showing Rodri Giggs driving a sports car while drinking champagne glamorizes gambling, says the watchdog. One of my examples, so sometimes things are banned. Here was one that was banned, a Paddy Power advert. So basically, Manchester United threatened to sue Paddy Power for the illegal use of Ole Gunnar Solskjaer's image in one of the adverts. Here, just above, said the bookie used an image of Solskjaer in a Brexit-inspired dig at Theresa May to promote bets on the Norwegians getting the United job on a permanent basis. Now, myself, whoever would use Ole Gunnar Solskjaer in something to promote their product, I just don't know where they get this idea from. But anyway, the other thing that is about gambling advertising, one thing I'm not going to talk too much about today, but I probably should have, is of course we can use advertising and marketing to actually promote responsible gambling. Okay, now here are 2 adverts. Okay, the one on the right, this is something I would actually say is from New South Wales in Australia. So the strap line here is, you're stronger than you think, take the first step, contact Gambling Help today. Now, unfortunately, the advert on the left, which was used in Singapore, part of their responsible gambling campaign, so what we've got here is, I hope Germany wins, my dad bet all my savings on them. Germany did win the World Cup in 2014. On this, the message that kind of came out from this, if you'd have followed this particular thing, is that you know, this would have actually worked out for the dad that used their piggy bank, you know, their son's piggy bank. So you've always got to be aware that there may be some unintended consequences of you putting out a particular advert. Right, now I'm going to get back to something more serious now. So that was my 10-minute interlude of looking at things that are what I consider to be socially irresponsible on the whole. So let's look at some of the empirical research. So myself and Elizabeth Killick, so we've recently written 2 systematic reviews looking at 23 different studies. Okay, so the first review was on the impact of sports betting advertising on human behavior, and we also did a review of all the research looking at the kind of content analysis of what you find in betting adverts. So in terms of the first one, so the impact of actual betting, sports and advertising marketing on human behavior. So what we were doing in our study, we wanted to describe the selected studies. You know, we did all the usual kind of academic things, which you're probably not going to be interested in this particular audience. But obviously what we're trying to look at is, to what extent does gambling advertising, gambling marketing actually have any effect on human behavior? So obviously we want to look at whether any of these studies actually told us anything. So 13 studies, all published in the last 8 years, I think. So there are 5 quantitative studies, 5 quantitative studies and 8 qualitative studies. So the empirical scientific base is very, very low at the moment when it comes to sports betting, advertising and marketing. The sample sizes here range from 131 up to 1,000. The one thing that we did find, there's a real bias in this field towards Australian studies, both in terms of content analysis studies and in terms of looking at the effects of gambling. So every single quantitative study that looked at the effect of gambling advertising on human behavior has been carried out in Australia. And in terms of the kinds of things that were looked at, so people, you know, these studies have looked at direct advertising messages, they've looked at gambling promotions that have been shown on television sport, looked at general television advertisements in general, and some of the studies have actually used what we call mock sports betting advertisements. So these have actually been designed to be manipulated to see what people think and how they behave when they see these types of advert. If we take all these, and again, what I'm trying to do today is, I'm not going to go through each individual study, but I'm trying to give you a synopsis of what the literature generally says. What you tend to find is that problem gamblers are more likely than non-problem gamblers to be influenced by gambling advertisements that encourage them particularly to make bets on sport, and more likely to make, you know, this issue of impulse betting. So again, problem gamblers are telling you that, you know, when they see an advert and it says bet now, being a problem gambler, that does sometimes seem to be a trigger for them. And these have been shown not only in terms of the kind of survey studies, but what we call these ecologically momentary assessment studies, where people are actually being contacted 7 or 8 times a day to say, have you seen an advert in the last hour? What happened as a result of that? So, you know, these kind of more ecologically valid types of experiment, and I think there's 3 or 4 of them now that have been done by Neroli Hing and colleagues in Australia, I do think is, you know, a step beyond the typical kind of survey research that people like me have been doing for many, many years. Problem gamblers, they often considered the contextual factors, so things like the promotion of sports betting were more likely to lead them to make these impulsive bets compared to non-problem gamblers. And participants who actually perceived gambling advertising in a positive way. So again, when you ask these attitudinal statements, do you like gambling? Those, again, it shouldn't probably be a surprise, but those people who are more positive towards gambling advertising, they're the one more likely to be at risk or problem gamblers. The results from the qualitative studies, these tend to be, you know, fairly similar, but you've got to remember here that we've got a much, much lower sample sizes here, obviously more in depth, but very, very low numbers. Here we've got the perceptions of the impact of sports betting advertising appears to be associated with a number of things. So it seems to be associated with problem gambling. So from the qualitative studies, vulnerable sports bettors classed either at risk or as problem gamblers, they're more likely to suggest that their betting behavior had been influenced by sports betting advertisements. The location of the advertisements, so again, problem gamblers who are at-risk gamblers who see gambling adverts actually within a particular sporting context. So they're at a stadium and they see something on the hoardings around the outside, or they're watching a television match and then they see a halftime, a pre-game or a halftime advert saying that put bets on these particular things. Results, and also the type of advertisement sometimes has an effect. So it may be that, for instance, having a female commentator tell you about gambling has less of an impact than if a male tells you. Whether it's somebody that it's all to do whether people who are gambling, they see the other person as knowledgeable or not. So there are things you can manipulate to see that whether this has an effect. So what we've got in the field of just looking at this impact of gambling advertisements on human behavior, most of them are quantitative, survey-based approaches. Most of them have been carried out in Australia. The impact of gambling advertising is often explored using individuals across a wide range of gambling. So we have got everybody from non-gamblers through to regular gamblers, through to at-risk and problem gamblers, and I think that's a good thing, that we've got lots of different groups that we can compare. And the impact of gambling advertising appears to be strongest for those who score higher on measures of problem gambling severity. And again, nearly every study that's been done has used just one particular gambling screen, the PGSI, the Problem Gambling Severity Index. So thankfully, even though there are well over 20 different gambling screens, when it comes to those working in the advertising and marketing area, they do seem to use one screen. So we can actually start to compare problem gamblers across these studies because they've used exactly the same instrument. When it comes to the content analysis of sports betting adverts, and this is where I've done far more research on this than looking at the impact of advertising on gambling and human behavior. So here what's happened is that people are applying content analysis to sports betting advertisements, and so we're looking at lots of different things within those adverts. And what we're trying to do is looking at using different theoretical methods to see whether they produce different things. And as I'm going to demonstrate on my next slide, you can use the same data set to actually look at things in a very different way, even though you might have the same corpus of data. What we found in this is only 10 studies that have content analyzed sports marketing and advertising. Now, on this particular slide, last year I did spend about 10 minutes going through some of these studies that we'd done. Of those 10 studies, 5 of them are actually studies that I've co-authored. But the interesting thing is 4 of these studies actually use the same data set, but we're using completely different theories and methodologies to look at this corpus of data in different ways. So at the top left, for instance, we started off doing a basic content analysis of around about 133 adverts that we basically take from TV and took off YouTube, covering 29 different sports betting operators. So we've actually looked at the largest number of different gambling operators when we've content analyzed these adverts. What we found in that study, for instance, probably won't surprise you, is that men are far more represented than females in gambling adverts. When women are there, they're not actually, nobody interacts with them there. They're almost there for kind of wallpaper purposes, not actually part of the advert at all. We then reanalyze the data using what we call metaphor theory. Okay, and what we found using metaphor theory is that the strong metaphors that come through in the same corpus of data is that gambling is something, it's almost like a love relationship with somebody. It's like a marketplace, particularly stock market marketplace. It's also something that people see gambling as a sport in and of itself. We also did another analysis where we used something called grounded theory, where you basically throw everything you know about gambling out the window and you start from the data upwards. And what came through from the 130 plus adverts that we were looking at is there are 2 themes that come through nearly all of the adverts. One, it's about minimizing the risks of gambling, and secondly, it's about this idea that you are in control of your gambling. Okay, so those that using it at a very basic level, these 2 messages come through in sports betting adverts. We also looked at, for instance, we used the same data set. We took out all those adverts that had the use of alcohol or junk food in the adverts. We actually found that there was a relationship between alcohol use and particularly highly emotionally charged events. So when people were scoring a goal, people were winning money but also drinking alcohol at the same time, looking at their phone but drinking a bottle of beer at the same time. we actually found nothing to do with junk food. Even though there was junk food in the adverts, junk food was not used simultaneously with the gambling experience. More recently, bottom right-hand corner, last year we actually analysed basically nearly 4,000 tweets at the start of the English Premiership football season. Again, we found that lots of the themes that come through in content analytic research are very similar in Twitter to what you find in more traditional TV and radio adverts. One thing that we did find in our kind of Twitter is that very rarely, it was less than 10%, is that responsible gambling is even mentioned. No reference to things like Gamble Aware. So over 90% of these adverts have, if you could argue, have no social responsibility message at all, anywhere in the advert at all. In terms of if you look at these content analytics studies, 3 of the Australian studies use bookmakers, 4 have used a British sample, and 3 have used a British and a Spanish sample. Sorry, are you coming up because I'm running out of time? 1 minute. Oh dear. Okay. What I'll do, so basically there's lots of different types of data that have been content analysed. This slide just shows that all the data sources that were used. The findings, what they actually show is that they've all been published very recently, all since 2012. So the number of betting brands ranges. We've got the highest number of betting brands in our ones, up to 29. They've used different kind of approaches to analyse this, but what are the main findings? So the narratives that you find in adverts, they use friendship and humour a lot. I mean, going back to my frivolous section where I was talking about irresponsible gambling, humour is used again and again and again. And it doesn't matter across whether it's on Twitter, in social media, on TV adverts, is that humour is used a lot. There are obviously major strategies that are identified. So if you look at these adverts, the things that come through, so power and control, adventure, thrill, winning, social status, happiness, sexualized imagery, patriotism, gender stereotypes, mateship. I mean, that patriotism, during the World Cup is that, if you don't bet on your home nation to win, you're a traitor. I mean, that's the kind of thing you find. I'm somebody, people accuse me of traitor all the time because I always bet against England when they're playing in the World Cup, which actually lost me a lot of money in the last World Cup because we reached the semi-finals. But normally, I do make money out of that. Now, since I'm being rushed for time, can I just quickly go through this 2 minutes? So for me, these are the do's and don'ts of socially responsible advertising. And again, it's trying reinforcing what I've been saying all the way through it. So obviously, don't promote gambling to vulnerable individuals, whether they're children, whether they're problem gamblers. Don't appeal to under 18s, and if you can, try and use people that are over 25 in the advert. Don't exploit cultural beliefs or traditions. Don't condone or feature gambling in a work environment. Don't exploit the susceptibilities, the aspirations, or credulity, inexperience, or of knowledge of under 18s or other vulnerable individuals. Obviously, promote your gambling in adult gambling environments at appropriate times. So when it comes to television advertising, certainly after the 9 p.m. watershed in the evening, avoid promoting gambling in non-gambling areas. Focus on entertainment rather than focus on entertainment rather than the gaming. Again, I've just repeated this, don't feature anybody under 25 in adverts. Avoid sending out promotional materials to self-excluders, which I think is very important. And again, we've done studies where we've been mystery shoppers, excluded ourselves, and we're still receiving all the marketing and advertising, even though we've self-excluded. And obviously comply with all the codes and conducts. I did have a couple more slides, but I'll leave it there because I'm running out of time. And hopefully you got the main message today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. You will be back in about 40 minutes for the Q&A.
Yeah.
And so will our next speaker. Her name is Sarah. And she will give us the bigger picture of business and sustainability. Today she is an independent consultant, but she has had senior sustainability roles at Unilever, Tesco and TUI. I want to welcome you, Sarah Holloway.
No? Can you hear me now? Wonderful. Hello, thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak to you today. As Heidi says, my name is Sarah Holloway. I have the honour of having, I think, the longest job title of anyone who's going to speak to you today. So I already feel like a winner on that front. We've had such a wonderful deep dive on advertising from Mark that I want to use my session, my 45 minutes with you, to invite you to step back a little bit and think about the bigger picture of sustainability, of all the different things that that encompasses. As Heidi said, my background is in sustainability strategy. I work with companies to think about what it is that society in the 21st century asks of us as businesses, and to respond in the way that we think is the best and most appropriate way to do that. I'm independent. I also work as an associate of digitalrg.net. Many of you will know who they are, but if you don't, it's an online tool that helps sustainability managers through the process of meeting your responsibilities and really thinking about what that means. Wonderful. So what I want to talk to you today is about three main questions. The first one is, what is happening in the world? Because it's very easy when you have a job to do to sit down, to look straight ahead and look at the things that are looking you in the face immediately. I want to step back and ask what's happening right now. I then want to talk about how business is responding, not just this industry, but business as a whole. And then I want to tackle how the gambling industry should respond. Now, I should say up front that most of my experience, as you'll have heard from the jobs that I've held, has been outside this industry. But I want to bring some of that experience to you and tell you a story of a different industry as some inspiration for how gambling might respond to this. But first, I want to ask you a question. I think I can use Menti for this. Is that right, tech team? I want to ask you, how confident are you that your organization is doing enough when it comes to sustainability? So if you work for an operator, you could think about your company right now. If you don't work for an operator, maybe think about the industry. But give me a feeling of how much you think you're doing out of 5. It started well, but it's going down. I'm going to give you 10 more seconds for anybody who'd like to vote but hasn't managed to get to the page yet. It looks like it's sitting stable at 3.5 out of 5, which is not bad. That sort of says we think we've got the basics covered, but there is more to do. Fantastic. Let's keep that in mind as I go through my presentation today. So let me start by tackling the first of my 3 questions. What's happening in the world? And if I had to sum that up in one sentence, it would be a lot. A lot is happening in the world right now. Here's the world as I see it at the moment in a few pictures. First of all, just a couple of weeks ago, we had climate strikes all the way around the world. About 4 million people are reported to have taken part in these, students and people striking from their work, with many schools and many organisations giving people the day off and to support those strikes. And that's people striking from all walks of life. The first climate strikes in my lifetime that have really involved everybody, not just the green community of people who really care about this, demanding that governments in particular take strong action to halt dangerous climate change all around the world. Sticking with the climate, we heard just last week that the German utilities company RWE is going to be carbon neutral by 2040, which means they'll be decommissioning the coal plants for which they're so famous, and they'll be investing in renewables. So an early sign, but one that entire industry is in transition right now, is starting to think about what it needs to do to be part of society and taking the first steps to get there. This is in California. These are Uber drivers and other types of gig workers who have just won a bill to be passed to say that they are allowed to have some of the protections that employees have. So lots of these companies have de-risked a lot of their operations by pushing risk onto the people who work for them and saying, you're not an employee, you can't have holidays or sick pay or any of those protections. They've just won the right to do it. Now, it's worth saying that between Uber and Lyft and DoorDash, they've raised $90 million to fight this, so that's not over yet. But this tells us of two different types of people clashing over what their rights and responsibilities are. Again, something in transition, something that's changing right now and could go either way. Some things have happened recently that mean that Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook may well have a face like this a lot of the time, which is from having grown hugely from its inception and being one of the really celebrated examples of small companies doing good. Lots of different legislators and areas are trying to take action against them to make sure that what they're doing is fair. In the US, 48 states have got together to launch an antitrust investigation to make sure that they are competing well with other people. All sorts of other different spaces are taking action to make sure that of data privacy, really investigating how Facebook and other big tech companies are affecting the way we live right now. As we understand what an impact they have, we're trying to get our arms around what we can do about it. And then finally, it's worth mentioning that the leaders of two of the most prominent English-speaking countries are being sued or are facing legal action against something they've done or something their government's done. Again, a period of huge transition and huge change. Everything I've shown you in these pictures happened in the last month. That was September. And this year has had many more months in it where many more things have happened. Everything is moving really fast right now. And my job as a sustainability consultant is to help businesses to understand what that means for them, to work out how it's relevant for them and how they can be relevant to society in such a time of change. There's a simple model I want to show you that I've simplified hugely. There are many more nuances than this, but I hope this gives you the shape of how I see business being on a journey. So 20 to 30 years ago, most people who worked in business really believed Milton Friedman's assertion that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. And we were in the sort of era of regulation-driven responsibility. So as long as you complied with the laws and made some philanthropic donations, that was fine. That was your responsibility. That's what we in wider society expected of you. Then things started to move when companies really thought about their risk and thought, well, actually, we have risk all over the place. We have reputational risk. There's risk in our supply chains. Will we always be able to get the raw materials that we need to do our work? How can we manage those risks and protect our reputation? So sort of sustainability and CSR was born to help companies do that, to work out where they were most vulnerable and to protect that vulnerability. And from there, things moved on when people started to spot opportunities in this same agenda to say, well, if our consumers are demanding more environmentally friendly products, for example, there's an opportunity for new product development and innovation to connect with our consumers, to connect with our employees, and really to seize opportunities to do that. And now the leading companies have moved further on even than that, and they're starting to have conversations about their purpose. Why do they exist in society? What's their purpose beyond profit? What is it they contribute to society? Why should we keep them? And that's where companies have a really deep think about this, align their business strategy with what they're doing, and use their advocacy and their power as an organization to drive forward that purpose. So not just looking at what they do and how they can make money, but looking at themselves as an actor in the world. And the most interesting thing about this journey is to look at where the attention goes of society. So it started off at the very beginning. People cared about where you spent your money. If you're a good business person, you spent your money really well, and we maybe asked you about that. But then in the middle too, we switched our attention to how you make that money. How does your business operate? How does your supply chain operate? How does this work? And in the era of purpose, we're now asking how you use your influence or your power in the world. We're recognizing that all sorts of people have different types of power that we maybe hadn't noticed, and we're asking them to use it responsibly. Some of the people who have supported this move to purpose are a bit more obvious. This is Richard Branson of Virgin, who has always been at the forefront of building a brand. And as you'd expect for someone who knows how brands work, he really knows that the brands that will thrive in the coming years are the ones that have a purpose beyond profit. So you probably expect him to be behind this. What you might not expect is that for more mainstream businesses to be coming around to this way of thinking. So this is a statement put out by the Business Roundtable, which is a group of 181 CEOs of some of the biggest companies in the United States. And you can see here I've cropped out the P companies who signed this. So you have PepsiCo, Pfizer, PwC, Procter & Gamble, so some of the really big companies. And in August, they came out with a statement where they wanted to redefine the purpose of a corporation away from shareholder primacy, so the idea that the most important thing you do as a business is to create value for your shareholders, and towards making all stakeholders in the business more equal. So they say each of our stakeholders is essential. We commit to deliver value to all of them for the future success of our companies, our communities, and our country. And you'll notice there that they still put the success of their companies first. They believe this is the way that value will be created in the future, which is by thinking about all their stakeholders. And these are by no means radical companies. They're the mainstream of American society. You'll see other people saying similar things. This is Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, who have trillions in active funds. And he writes a letter once a year to everybody to say where he thinks the future of business is. And in the last few years, his letters have been almost entirely about purpose, about understanding what it is that you do as a company as a way to make that company successful. He says to prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society. Again, not a radical hippie, but someone right in the middle of finance. And then finally, I don't know how many of you read the Financial Times from London, but a few weeks ago they released a new agenda. They say, capitalism, time for a reset. Business must make a profit, but should serve a purpose too. So they, as one of the bastions of the finance media, are behind this. So this is very much now the mainstream conversation about where business should be going. So I wanted to ask you another question using Menti, if I can, which is thinking about this very simplified journey. Where do you think your industry is? Remember, we started with regulation, through to risk, through to opportunity, and finally at purpose. I'd love to hear where you think you are. I'd be very interested to hear from Mark or some of the psychologists if whether having this on the screen influences the next person's button. Maybe they're fighting up and down. We started higher, we're sort of landing just in the middle. So somewhere on risk and opportunity, which I would, from what I've been hearing today, I would really agree with, that your place on this journey is somewhere in the middle. I'm going to go to the next one and see if I can give you some inspiration about how you might travel further up that journey. So, my second of three questions, how is business responding? We've already seen the macro conversation at the top, which is moving ever further towards purpose as a way to make your company successful in the long term. But I want to tell you a story of one particular industry that I know very well, which is the consumer goods industry. And the consumer goods industry is made up of some small companies, but many, many giants, people like Unilever, Nestle, Procter & Gamble, Mars, Danone, all those huge companies that then in turn own the brands that you buy every day. And consumer goods are those that are all around your house. So what you eat, what you drink, what you feed your pets, personal care products that you put on your body, the household cleaning products that you use every day, all of those are consumer goods. They're a huge industry, and they have a series of challenges. And I'd love to do a low-tech version of asking some questions to you today, not using Menti, but I'm going to tell you what some of the key challenges are for the consumer goods industry. And I'd love to have a show of hands of anybody who thinks that this is also a challenge for the gambling industry. And the first one is the war for talent. They want to find the best people and keep the best people, which is harder than it sounds. Does anybody recognize that as a challenge for this industry? Quite a few hands going up. I think it's a challenge for everyone. Everyone wants the best, most innovative, entrepreneurial, hard-working people out there. The second is declining consumer trust. So people are less willing to trust big brands now than they have been at almost any point in history. Starting from when the big box brands began in sort of the 30s, 40s, 50s, when they were universally trusted, things have changed significantly. Do you recognize this for this industry, declining trust? A few hands too. Regulations. For consumer goods, there are lots of different regulations, and increasingly so as we begin to understand, for example, the role that diet plays in some of the biggest health problems in the world. Different places are beginning to put in regulations on, for example, salt and sugar, and that's in addition to business regulations around antitrust and competition. Does anybody recognize that as something that's a real concern for this industry, regulations and good relationships with regulators? Lots of hands here. Investors, of course, if you're a publicly listed company in particular, you'll have investors that are looking for a return, and a short-term return at that. Is that a challenge for you guys who are operators? Some hands too. One of the really interesting challenges that consumer goods have is market saturation in traditional markets. So we can buy more shampoo and we can buy more food, but there really is a limit to how much food or consumer products you can sell to one person. So one of the things that lots of these companies are trying to do is move into emerging markets because they can't keep selling into the same market again and again. Is that a challenge here, or is this the one where we're going to decide there isn't such an alignment? Couple of hands, but few. And then the final one, I'm pretty confident, isn't quite going to match up with you, which is supply chain challenges. If you are selling a physical product and that product has its origin in agriculture, for example, and if climate change is changing where you can grow and soil degradation means that you don't have such a reliable crop anymore, and water scarcity means that in some areas it's very difficult to do that, there are additional supply chain challenges caused by physical changes, and that's in addition to supply chain challenges in general. It's always very difficult to manage a supply chain, and this makes it tougher. Does anyone want to admit to a supply chain challenge, or this is a different industry? So that's a picture of the challenges that they're dealing with, and I want to tell you how they've dealt with it. And they've broadly done 4 things, which I'm going to come back to. First of all, they have acknowledged there is a problem. This is the CEO of Danone, Emmanuel Faber, who says the food revolution is real, the old model is broken. And he's been saying that repeatedly for the last few years because it's really become apparent to that company and to the industry as a whole that the way that we grow, make, consume, dispose of food really isn't working. Now, you notice what he isn't saying is that this is my company's fault or that we are going to fix it right now. He's acknowledging a systemic problem that affects his industry to mean that they can start doing things about it. The second thing they've done is they've leaned into their big problems. There are some really big challenges, and you saw some of them before, but I want to talk about these 4 here. On the top left is cocoa beans. Now, cocoa is a very, very difficult industry to work in. We lose about 40% of the global cocoa crop to disease every year. There are plenty of very strangely named cocoa bean diseases that mean that it's very difficult to do, and it means it's very difficult to make money if you're a grower. Hence, fair trade and all those programs that are trying to help people to increase their yield and increase the money that they get. And companies like Mars, who rely on this for some of their most iconic products, are really getting in there and trying to help people to adapt to climate change and to help them take home a greater proportion of that money. On the top right here, you have laundry. Now, when I worked at Unilever, we did a huge environmental footprint of our products through their entire value chain. So that's from the raw materials right through to disposable. And found out that 68% of the greenhouse gas footprint of Unilever products as a whole was in the consumer use phase. That was the greenhouse gases that were emitted as the consumer used that product. And that was driven by laundry products and products that were meant to be used in the shower, because heating water takes an awful lot of energy. So the strategy of that company became very directed towards helping consumers heat less water for those products and to innovate into products that didn't need so much heated water to be used. Ooh. Excuse me while I find my right slide. On the bottom left is Fairy, which is a Procter & Gamble product, and this particular bottle is made of ocean plastic in response to the huge consumer interest in single-use plastics, and that's something that all consumer goods companies are really starting to take into account as a really challenging problem to dig into. And then finally, on the bottom right, you have palm that makes palm oil. And many of you will have heard that palm oil is a very controversial ingredient. It's in lots and lots of products because it's easy to grow. It's fairly sustainable to grow in some ways. It's healthy and flexible and does all sorts of really good things. And it has one problem, which is that it drives deforestation. So the financial incentives for growers of palm mean that it's much easier to cut down some rainforest and grow some more palm rather than to invest in increasing the yields in the land that you already have. So these are some of the really core problems that they're facing into. But what this industry has done is not only focus on its problems, but focus on its assets, focus on where it can really be adding value and contributing to society. And this is what this next slide is about. These two top pictures here are both from the same brand, Axe or Lynx, depending on where you are in the world, a deodorant brand of Unilever's. And you will, I'm sure, have seen those adverts which use stereotypes of women to sell mainly to teenage boys. Unilever took a pledge a few years ago that they would no longer perpetuate harmful stereotypes in their advertising. So that product has had to really think about how it's going to get its message across to the same audience with the same power, but using a different message. And what they've come up with is different definitions of masculinity and what it means to use their product. On the bottom left is a picture of the Consumer Goods Forum, which is the industry body for the consumer goods industry, who runs a series of work streams that help companies to collaborate on some of the biggest challenges. So if you are having challenges with the environmental sustainability of your supply chain, for example, it follows that your competitors are too, and it's something that you can work on together in a pre-competitive space. So there are lots of ways in which they can work together, and their industry body supports that. And then finally, this last one here, I've cheated a little bit because this is not actually a consumer goods company. It's from Tiffany. And it was an advert that was taken out in newspapers around the US when the administration took that country out of the Paris Agreement on climate change. And they just wrote a letter in their beautiful Tiffany blue saying that they felt that was the wrong decision and that they were still in for bold climate action. A really easy way of connecting with their stakeholders and showing what they stood for. So these are all examples of those, the industry and the companies within that industry accepting the influence and the power that they have that's not necessarily linked to a problem and deciding to make something better. That's the third thing that they did. And then I want to show you this model, which I use with my clients, that helps to make sense of those last two things. So I've talked about fixing problems, and I've talked about contributing to society. And what this model allows people to do is to see how those two things fit together. You probably know that when you look at a picture of an iceberg, that there is always far more below the surface than there is at the top. And I use this as a model to help people think this through. So below the surface are your problems of being a responsible business and managing your own challenges. And that tends to be a really big bulk of challenges. See if you can just think of some of the challenges for this industry in your head right now. We'll go on to that, but start thinking about what fits at the bottom of that iceberg for you. But above the surface is using your influence and the assets that you have to drive positive change. And it's often this that really helps people to understand how they can contribute to society and not think of this agenda as something that is just trying to fix intractable problems. The important thing about the iceberg is the bit above the surface is the bit that people see, is the bit that builds your relevance, that builds trust, that builds perception of your organization. But it's equally important that the surface of the iceberg can't exist without the bottom of it being in place. And then finally, this industry, the consumer goods industry, came along to the same place that the conversation is right now and started thinking about their purpose beyond profit. Because when you start building that iceberg, when you start thinking about that, that's where the conversation tends to take you. So some of these really big companies now have very clear, very strong purposes that motivate their employees more than anything else that they have. So Danone, who does bottled water, baby food, baby milk, yogurt, says their job is to bring health through food to as many people as possible. So they're talking about driving a portfolio with greater health benefits and then making it accessible to everybody. Unilever has a purpose of making sustainable living commonplace, looking at the full range of the products that everybody uses every day and says, with tiny little changes to these, we can make this an everyday occurrence. And Nestlé talks about enhancing quality of life and contributing to a better future. A little bit more vague, that one, not my favorite, but it shows that all these companies are really beginning to grapple with what sits at the very top of what they want to do with their companies. So just to recap, what I went through there are 4 stages of what that industry did, and they asked themselves 4 key questions. And the first one is, what's broken in our system? You remember that Emmanuel Faber on his slide saying our food system is broken. What's broken in our system? What do we need to acknowledge are the systemic challenges for every industry before you can move on to solve them? The second is, what are the core problems to fix? What's at the bottom of that iceberg that sits there, and until you fix it, you won't be able to have the top of that iceberg? Then moving to the top of it, where can we use our influence to drive positive change? And fourth, what is our purpose beyond profit? When you add these up, what happens? And I'm going to come back to these questions in just a second. And just to finish off this story, I want to tell you about some of the benefits that consumer goods industry is reaping from doing this. The first is financial performance. Unilever reports that its sustainable living brands, the ones that have purpose at their core and who are really taking this seriously, are growing more than 50% faster than the others, and they account for the majority of that company's turnover growth. So they know that there is a link between their financial performance and that decision to make them purpose-driven. For talent attraction and retention, one of the things that lots of people put their hands up for in this room, again, Unilever is one of the #1 employees in many, many of its countries for recent graduates, and they attribute that almost entirely to their sustainability program. When they talk to people about why they want to join the company, that's the program that everybody wants to join. Of course, there are benefits in terms of their social license to operate and even their actual license to operate where that exists. They're able to make a really good case and a really authentic case for being the sort of business that you want to have around in your territory. They've grown resilience in their supply chains. You remember the challenges that they've had through both sort of environmental change and making sure people are paid well. The programs that they have in place now allow them to make them more resilient into the future. So as things do change, they will be in the best position to keep growing value with their companies. They can open up new markets for growth. So, for example, if you make a laundry detergent that doesn't need you to heat the water in line with the sustainability commitments, it turns out that's also brilliant for people living in places where water is not easily heated. So you can go out to new markets and say, we have a product that will work for you. And then finally, trust and reputation. I think this industry suffered the horse meat scandal a few years ago. It was very difficult for them. They did lots of things to get back on top of it, but one of the things that allowed them to do that is this work into their supply chain so they could very rapidly work out what had happened and recover from that much faster than if they were caught on the back foot. And I want to give the last word to the man I gave the first word to, which is Emmanuel Faber of Danone, who sums it up by saying it's a matter of staying relevant as a company. That's his bottom line for this work. He knows that to stay relevant, he needs to do this stuff. So that's enough storytelling from me. I want to start thinking about how the gambling industry should respond to some of these challenges and maybe use a couple of the models and tools that I've put in here. But I want to ask you one more question on Menti before I do so, which is, what do you think is your biggest industry challenge? And I've given you some options here. If you can't choose, please try to pick one. The votes are still coming in, but I think we have a clear winner of building trust with stakeholders and lots of votes also for complying with regulations and building customer loyalty. So some very similar challenges and some challenges that can really be helped by some of the things that we're talking about today. Let's move on, I think, if everybody's voted. So let's go back to those 4 questions. And I want to pose a series of questions to you to think about and also to keep in your head for the rest of today. I don't know your industry inside out, but you do. So these questions I'm asking you are slightly naive questions, and they're meant to make you think rather than giving you an answer. But let's start with the first big question. What's broken in our system? What do we need to acknowledge about the systemic challenges that face us in our industry? And my thought starters for you was, where does your money come from? We've talked about the challenge of problem gamblers. What would you have to acknowledge about their contribution to your bottom line in order to move on from here? Do you have to acknowledge it's a large proportion of the money you make? Is it very small? What's the truth around that? And as soon as you can be confident about stating what the truth is around that, that allows you to go off and fix that challenge. But as well as that, again, broadening out and looking at the bigger picture, what's your cultural legacy? What do you have to stay with the messages that you put out into the world about what our culture, our shared culture is and what it should be? Is it going in a positive direction or a negative direction? And how can you use your power to change that? What's your industry's environmental legacy? Is it a system with a huge environmental footprint, a small one? What are you doing about that, and how are you participating in the collective challenge that we have, particularly on climate change right now? And I'll come and talk about that in a second. So that's my first question to you. Think about what's broken. What do you need to acknowledge there? What are the core problems to fix? That's the bottom of the iceberg, the things that build the core of your credibility and your trust. So obviously responsible gaming and gambling, we're going to talk about that a lot today, and I know historically this conference has focused down on that. But what about cybersecurity? A huge issue, something never to be forgotten and that forms a really core part of what you do. Anti-money laundering and sports integrity would also be a huge part of this to make sure that's working really well. The environment, as I mentioned just now, diversity and inclusion, even something as simple as tax. Are you paying a fair amount of tax in all the territories in which you operate? Very few companies or industries are. And the legality of your operations. Are you legally in every country that in which you're placed? If not, why not? What's the thinking behind that? And really interrogate not only what that means to you, but what that means to the people who work with you. I want to pick off one of these because it's one that doesn't feel very important, but is very close to my heart, which is the environment. Because you're not oil and gas, you don't have a huge, huge footprint, but you are on online gaming, and we know that data centers will consume 3 times as much energy in the next decade as they do now. In fact, IT has overtaken aviation as a contributor to climate change in the last few years. And it doesn't feel like it should, because every small thing takes a small amount of energy. But actually now that we are more reliant than ever on technology, technology is becoming one of our biggest challenges. So my challenge to you on the environmental front is that every company should have a responsibility to bring its carbon footprint down as far as possible and to net zero if possible as part of the global effort to tackle climate change. Our third question was looking at the top of that iceberg. Where can we use our influence to drive positive change? And my thought starters for you are, you're an amazing industry with international reach. How can you use that? How can you use that for the benefit of society? How can you use your marketing power to change the culture? How can you use the tech skills of the amazing people you have at your disposal to hack some of the biggest social and environmental problems that we have? This is the more exciting part for a lot of people of this iceberg, is to say, what can we do? What can we positively give? Remembering, of course, that you need to have both parts. And again, I'm going to pick on one issue here, but not go into it in too much depth, because Mark did go into this in a lot more depth. But these are just two images that I found. One is from the ICE Totally Gaming conference on the left. These beautiful young ladies are there to help you understand that you should come closer to the stand. And on the right is the Moroccan sports betting organization, who has for the last few years been featuring images of powerful women in sport as part of their advertising. These two sides of this slide give me a very different message about who I am, what I should look like, and my value to the world. And my question would be, which of those would you like to be putting out into the world? Both of them work as advertisements, both of them provoke a strong reaction in me, but which one do you really want? And then finally, that big question. And this is, I think, how your industry can leap over that whole journey by going straight to some of these questions. So if you keep any questions in your head today during the rest of this day, I'd like it to be this slide of questions. With question 4, what's our purpose beyond profit? And my thought starters for you are, what is the positive benefit of gambling? What business are you in? We've heard a lot about, people wanting to go and have fun and to be entertained. So if you're an entertainment business, what sense does it make to benchmark yourself against some of the sin businesses, oil, alcohol, and cigarettes? And just think for a moment with me, what would it be like to benchmark yourself against other entertainers? What if Disney is where you benchmark yourself? What if their social responsibility program is where you aim for? How does that change how you see yourselves and your role and how big sustainability can be for you? And then finally, think about how somebody else could reframe your industry if you do not. And again, I have a bit to dig into here. On the right-hand side here is a headline from the UK that I didn't have to search very far to find, which is major flaws revealed in government's attempt to tackle crack cocaine gambling machines. So you're already being reframed. Your purpose, as far as the people who wrote this headline, is clear. It's to addict people to what you sell. The very, very interesting example I would compare this to is something that happened a couple of months ago where the London Stock Exchange reclassified all of its oil and gas holdings under the header of non-renewables. So no longer called oil and gas, they were called non-renewables, and there was a section for renewables. Think about what influenced that. That's society telling the stock exchange that it now wished to have renewables and non-renewables, and that the direction we're going in is renewables. Now, interestingly, just last week, that decision was reversed. They're now called oil and gas again, because the trade bodies were very, very angry, first of all, but also put forward the very good argument that actually most single companies don't trade in either renewables or non-renewables. They tend to do both, and therefore the classification doesn't make sense. But that's an attempt to reframe an entire industry by someone with no particular agenda to do so, who was following and reflecting what society expected of it. So I'd encourage you to think, what is the framing that you would like to put on this, the authentic framing, and what could somebody else do to undo that? So, my final thoughts, which are basically a recap for you, are please remember this journey of the different stages, because I think it's a useful way of thinking about where you are and where you could be on it. And my question to you would be, how is it that you can push towards the right-hand side of this journey and move further on? And then finally, I would suggest that your next step for today, but also when you get back to your desks, is to ask these 4 questions. What is broken in our system? What do we need to acknowledge as a systemic challenge for us? Not just for me or not just for my company, but for all of us in the system. What are the core problems to fix? Where can we use our influence to drive positive change? And what is our purpose beyond profit? And I'd like to leave you with this slide and those questions to ask yourselves today. And that's all I have to say to you before questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. And speaking about questions, it's time for Q&A. So Henrik and Mark, can you please come up here again? And we will have an extra chair too. And now you can use Menti to push your questions. And you can also do it the old-fashioned way with a microphone. Just raise your hand if you have a question, and you will be handed a microphone and be able to ask.
I feel like I'm on blind date.
And we already have some questions from Menti. Henrik, we have a question for you over here. How would further legislation in Sweden around gambling advertising impact Kindred Group?
Yeah, as I said in the opening interview that we had, I think the further restrictions would just play in the favor of the unregulated operators in Sweden. And as Mark was alluding to as well, it's clearly there where customer could be pushed on to operators where there's absolutely no control. I think it's really bad, and if we're seeing already now sort of a challenge with channelization in the Swedish market, any further restrictions on marketing would just play in the favor of the unregulated operators and would be even worse for channelization. So it's absolutely the wrong way to go if you want to increase channelization in Sweden.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is for Mark. Do you see similarities between gambling addiction and other addictions in advertising and past bans such as cigarettes and alcohol?
Yes, there are obvious similarities. They're all, obviously, those three are the kind of what is it when you have three things together? I mean, gambling, smoking, and alcohol are often seen as these three consumptive industries that, when taken to excess, can lead to various addictive behaviors. However, I would argue that when you look at things like health benefits, I mean, there is no evidence at all that, for instance, moderate gambling has any negative effect on you whatsoever, okay? But when we take drinking and particularly smoking, these are something, when you take to excess, will have major health benefits for you. Now, it's interesting, I'm listening to Sarah, because one of the things about reframing the gambling industry is that when I gamble, I'm buying entertainment, okay? Now, I always say this, you say, how can you reframe, if I'm marketing or advertising gambling, I would be saying, I always give this story, and I'm sorry for the people who have heard this before, because I say it so many at my talks. When I go to my local casino and I play roulette, I will walk in at 6:30 in the evening, I will have a subsidised, lovely cordon bleu meal, I will have subsidised drinks, I'll have a couple of hours at the gaming table, and I'm a real cheapskate, because I play with 50p chips. When I walk out at the end of the evening, I've probably spent around about £35, maybe €40, 400 kroner. That's actually cheaper than me watching Nottingham Forest lose. That's actually cheaper than me watching Noel Gallagher at the arena for a night's entertainment for £35. And sometimes I walk out and I've won, or I broke even, or whatever. That, and obviously, I'm not against people moderately drinking. I'm totally against smoking of any way, shape, or form. I'm sorry to the smokers in the room. But there are similarities, and of course, governments, they see these similarities, that this is something that, it should be taxed, it should be, should be minimal advertising. And then, we've seen what's happening in the tobacco world, no advertising at all. Drinking now, I think people realise that, there are some moderate good effects of drinking moderately in terms of social inhibition and getting us to feel good or whatever. And that is where gambling is going to be. I think the countries that are now banning gambling advertising, that's not going to be a way forward. You've let the genie's out of the bottle now. Banning gambling advertising will not stop gambling. Banning alcohol advertising will not stop drinking. And of course, banning tobacco advertising is not stop smoking. But yes, there are similarities, but I do think, and going back to this reframing question, I do think it's something that the gambling industry can do.
Thank you. Do you agree, Henrik?
Absolutely. I think it's a very good point. I think it's very noteworthy what we discussed regarding the sustainability aspects and how that can be seen. What is the greater purpose, as I mentioned? How can we become a net contributor to society, sort of in the overall scheme of things?
Let's move on. We have a hand down here.
Yeah, I got a question for Mark. I'm from Norway, and in Norway we have a monopoly. As a professor. Sorry about that. I can take it again. I'm from Norway. Hi, I'm Kim. Got a question for Mark. In Norway, we have a gambling monopoly. Have you, through your research, found any proof that a monopoly is more sustainable and responsible than a regulated license market?
In a short answer, no. And I also say that I have a conflict of interest here. Some people may know that I've got a huge contract with Norsk Tipping. So I've been working with them for a long time. You may know, well, you may not or may not know, it's been 2006. It was my evidence in the Supreme Court in Norway that banned all slot machines in Norway. And then it was me that kind of reevaluated the new interactive video terminals in 2008 when they came in. Of course, that whole system arose because, of course, there were all these illegal operators running slot machines in Norway. And so the decision was made that in terms of controlling the supply of slot machines throughout Norway, the best way to do that was through a monopoly model. The problem with a monopoly model, of course, is, the thing about monopoly models in countries now, we have to realize with online gaming, is that these borders don't really exist now. And of course, although for me, I can't play on Norsk Tipping products because I don't have a Norwegian social security number. I don't speak Norwegian anyway. But the point is, you as someone from Norway can go and gamble on William Hill Gala. You can come and gamble on all our English sites. So the answer is I don't know what I think in terms of physical gambling, monopolies are a good way of, if you like, controlling the supply chain of what is out there, but it doesn't actually control the whole problem of gambling because now we have gambling without borders in the form of remote gambling.
Any other hands? Over there?
It's a question for Mark also. Thanks for a great talk. Did I hear you correctly that while you measured some effect on adverts on problematic gamblers, also that was mostly based on self-descriptions rather than any monetary evidence or something like that of increased consumption as a result of the ads?
Yeah, the answer is yes. And even when we ask them about monetary spending, it's still self-report. And of course, the most difficult question to ask somebody, particularly how much money have you spent on gambling over the last year, there are so many different ways that you can interpret that. So yes, that's the real problem with self-report. But as I say, these new ecological models where you're getting people, basically to fill out a kind of diary, whether it's through your mobile phone or whatever, 8 times a day. If I was being triggered 8 times a day, how many gambling adverts have you seen in the last hour? Have you gambled as a result of it? I think that's a lot more accurate than going to somebody and saying, over the last 3 months, how many times did you gamble as a result of seeing an advert? So yeah, you're exactly right. And that's the real problem with any of the kind of self-report measures. And of course, as I say, there are so many what we call biases. I mean, if I was to interview you about something, you're going to probably give me socially desirable answers as a result of doing that. And we know there are memory recall biases. A lot of people, they don't deliberately lie, but of course, they don't accurately remember what they've done. And gambling is one of those things. So one of the interesting things we did actually using Norsk tipping data. Okay, so we've just published a study where, of course, what we've got is the totality of a person's actual expenditure, but we also sent out a self-report survey asking how much people had spent with Norsk tipping over the protracted period. Probably won't surprise you to know is that those people who gamble very infrequently were very, very accurate. So those people, for instance, they know they buy 2 lottery tickets a week. Very accurate in terms of particularly casino gamblers, sports gamblers who are gambling very regularly across the week. They had no idea how much they were spending, and they vastly underreport how much they're spending. And so we know, and you might say, well, that was obvious, but now there have been 2 studies now showing that if you match up an actual gambler's gambling expenditure with what you've actually done with what they self-report, very, very different, particularly if you're a heavy gambler. Of course, problem gamblers there'll be some problem gamblers in that heavy gambling group.
Thank you. And then we have a question for Sarah from Menti. Sarah, how do gambling operators avoid cynicism when aligning themselves to supporting big societal problems?
Oh, I like this question. I particularly like the word cynicism in the middle of it because it's a very loaded word, cynicism. So I think my first question back to you about this is to ask whether the cynicism is warranted or whether it's unreasonable, because that's the key difference, I think, between somebody being protective and cynical. I think in my experience, the way to avoid cynicism and way to build trust with all sorts of different stakeholders is to do a couple of things. The first is to be trustworthy. I know that sounds like something that doesn't really need saying, but building trust between 2 people is only a good thing if both of those people are trustworthy. If you attempt to build trust between 2 friends and you know one of them really shouldn't be trusted, you're doing both of them a disservice in the end. So the first thing to say is you need to build your iceberg with lots in the bottom in order to have that trust at the top. And I think the second thing to say is that humans are very good. Humans have evolved to be very good at knowing when to trust somebody and when to be cynical about somebody. And you can learn a lot by thinking about how it is that you represent yourself as an authentic and trustworthy person to other people. You might show some humility. You would always make sure you keep your promises. If something goes wrong, you would take responsibility for that thing and try to put it right. You might be a little bit vulnerable and tell people how you really feel, or tell somebody that something is happening that's not perfect in your life, because then they know you're another person and that you're trying to make it better. And those qualities of a trustworthy person, I think, can be taken on by companies and brands to say if a person trusts a person because of these things, a person can trust a brand because of those. So the communications that you send out there to avoid cynicism need to be authentic, but also need to be really trustworthy with some of those human qualities in them.
Sorry, can I just add one thing to that?
Because
I think when we talk about gambling and trust, and I mean, Henry, I think a question that you raised, Heidi, about the perception of the gambling industry and do the people trust the gambling industry. The thing about gambling and trust, of course, if for businesses to be successful, they're going to have trust at the core. And I'll give you an example. This is actually from 10 years ago, but it's a true example. I was doing some work for Svenska Spel, the Swedish gambling operator, and they were about to bring poker onto the market. And of course, at that particular time, poker was a big, online. It was a really big poker boom. Lots of companies with lots of market share. How does a little minnow like Svenska Spel come onto the Swedish market, where they know that Swedish players, and that's why they were bringing poker, because they knew the Swedish market, there was a market out there. What they found is that within a week or so of launching their product, they had thousands and thousands of people suddenly playing. And when we did some research, follow-up market research with the Swedish Svenska Spel customers, what they said the number one factor from playing with these offline operators as Svenska Spel was that they trusted Svenska Spel because they know Svenska Spel has responsible gambling at the heart of what they do. And as a poker player, I don't want to be knowing that I'm taking loads of money off somebody who's a problem gambler or somebody that may not be able to afford to do what they're doing. It's because of all the infrastructure Svenska Spel had in place, I feel safe that when I'm taking money off somebody else, those people can afford to lose it. So trust, I do think, whether if you're in a competing market, even if society as a whole has gambling isn't seen as trustworthy, amongst your players is that they will gravitate to the companies that they trust.
How important is that trust for you, Henrik?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. We work very actively on that from Kindred's perspective. We are the only company in our sector that got a AAA rating on ESG. And a large part of that is coming from the work we do with responsible gambling and the systems that we develop together with Mark and leading researchers and treatment specialists. So trust is absolutely core for brands, and without trust you don't get anywhere. And also trust is a condition to be profitable as well. Without trust you won't make any profit, and you won't be long-term, and you won't be sustainable. So it's absolutely critical.
And when we are talking about advertising, talking about collaboration, you talked about that earlier. How much do you use studies and research from academics like Mark when you develop your adverts?
Yeah, we use those, but we also we apply the research and studies into our technology and our algorithms and how we operate as a company as well. As I said, with the RG work that we do, and our player safety early detection system is really built on that, which is a foundation for the AAA rating that we have. So it's about looking at from that perspective. As I said, in Sweden, from New Year's now, we've changed the communication messaging a lot more towards the responsible gambling and not call to action, but rather highlighting the potential risks as well, and seeing a very positive reaction from the customers in building trust with that.
Thank you. I saw another hand down there. Yes? We just need the microphone.
How you doing? David from Gibraltar. Just a question for all of you, really. At what stage should the regulators start to put a bit more focus and pressure on the media with their own role within this? So if we take Mark's presentation today, it's focused a lot on the content that the betting companies are giving to the media agencies to advertise, etc. And whilst I fully concur that we need to do a lot more as an industry, well, actually, if you look at it, you'll have, say, a marketing manager maybe from Unibet would approach say, Sky, for example, for a slot on TV. That same Sky sales manager will probably be approaching 5 more betting companies. So they obviously control the ads that go on the TV. They know what's going on. And then likewise, you'll get situations whereby you'll have a media, obviously someone like the Daily Mail, news headline, negative impact on gambling and the irresponsible gambling, and yet in the same publication they've got sponsored betting columns. Their headlines read 1,000-to-1 winner in the football or the golf, and so they've got a big role themselves. And you only need to take this as a perfect example. Last year, I think ICE gaming conference in London, huge negative press about what we're doing as an industry, when actually this would never make the media, and actually this is a really forthcoming, proactive thing that the industry are doing. And for me, I feel the media need to be held a lot more accountable and more pressure come from regulators to do something.
Who will begin?
Well, I totally agree with you that, sorry, I mean, those hypocrisies that you're outlining, we know they all exist. I know, so I work a lot on problem video gaming, but I actually write loads of papers on the positives of video gaming. I mean, I've written papers on the positives of gambling, but that will never get in the press. You know, today we've got the story big back home that the first ever online video gaming addiction treatment on the NHS. It's made national headlines today, okay? Whenever you talk about, games having, as a force for good, it doesn't get the publicity, and I put out loads of press releases. If I put out a positive story, it doesn't really make the news. But if it's, it's like that old cliche, if it bleeds, it leads, and that's what happens. Unfortunately, it takes people, luckily I have got a high media presence, and I hopefully, whenever I'm interviewed, particularly when I'm live, I always give a balanced thing. But of course, when you're interviewed and it's pre-recorded, they say, Mark, so what are the good things about gambling? What are the bad things about gambling? And of course, you know that they're going to clip the bad things about gambling. In terms of regulation, of course, I'm not a regulator, but I think regulators are beginning to realise is that media hold a lot of sway. But of course, they want to be evidence-based when they make these things. But sometimes there is I could have said today that the old cliche that an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And it's regulators, I think, like to have evidence-based stuff. But of course, that sometimes, we always talk about regulators and policymakers and legislators being 3 steps behind everybody else. And that is the real problem in this industry, that if you're going to take that approach, is that you're always going to be playing catch-up.
Any contribution?
Interestingly, I think the challenge with the media is one that's blanket across all industries. As Mark says, if it bleeds, it leads. Journalists are looking for conflict or something to spark an emotion in their readers. So you're always going to have a focus on those things. And certainly in all the industries I've worked with, the same thing happens, that something good will happen and something bad will happen. And guess which one will end up, leading the media. I think in terms of regulation, I'm always slightly nervous about recommending regulators go after the media, because having a free press is one of the real bastions of our society. But I do think if you are in the position of giving fodder to the media, if you're out there giving that, one of the things that you can do is make sure you're always contextualizing it, always giving positive things as well, and making sure that that's available to them and that they understand why that's important. And there are parts of the media that are trying to look at this. There's a publication called Positive News, which is a magazine every couple of months that really focuses down on good things. Now that's for people who opt in. It's not the newspaper that most people are going to read every morning, but those are some people who are making inroads into that and trying to make sure that these positive stories get out as well.
Thank you. Then we have a question for all of you. What would be the single most impactful change the gambling industry can make to build trust with stakeholders? Henrik, you can begin.
I think transparency and increased transparency, I think, is an absolute fundamental for that. And we're trying to push the boat out a bit in the last 2 years with our sustainability report and trying to put numbers on certain issues and what we're working with. And I think that's something we need to continue to do and test and really be bold in a sense, and trying to be honest and outcoming with numbers and facts and realities, because it's also in our industry, when you see certain companies are growing way faster than others, is sort of a question mark. How is that possible if everyone's got almost the same things? Is it because they're more aggressive or not? I think it's only by conveying sort of the truth and the transparency and increasing transparency and be persistent on it and continue to push. I think that's one of the key things to do, at least.
Sarah, I know you're not from this industry, but do you have a suggestion anyway?
I do, actually, and I would agree with everything that Henrik said then about transparency being absolutely key. I think I'd actually go back to the final point that I made in my presentation about purpose and the frame through which you see the world. And I think if there was one change I would recommend, it's to really lock down what is the positive contribution of this industry to society, what is it that we collectively know that we're giving to the world, and then to work out what that means for smaller changes that make a difference. But framing that really well is step number 1.
Mark, do you have anything?
Well, I echo what the two previous answers were. For me, I mean, I've been in this business 32 years now, and the one thing that's really changed over this time that I do think helps things move forward is engaging with other stakeholders, even if they're from a completely different perspective from you. 30 years ago, I was public enemy number 1 in Britain because I did problem gambling, and people assume that if you work in problem gambling, you're anti-gambling, which is not true at all. My friends who work in alcoholism, they're not anti-drinking, yet, me working in problem gambling, I'm seen as, was seen as anti-gambling, and I think some people in Britain still see me as anti-gambling, but I'm not at all. But what wouldn't have happened 30 years ago is to have a conference like this, where you've got treatment providers, policymakers, legislators, regulators, the industry. I mean, the idea of industry and academics being in the same room was just an anathema 30 years ago. But that, and I think the only way forward is to bring all the, you have to air all these perspectives and come to a common understanding. So it's just saying, these are all the issues. We know that there are issues around problem gamblers and the kind of destruction it can cause for that minority of individuals. But that doesn't mean that somebody that's anti-gambling shouldn't realise that the vast majority of people who gamble don't have any problems, they enjoy it, etc. So yeah, it's just about bringing everyone together.
Thank you so much, Mark. One more question? We have time for one more? No? Then I want to say thank you to the three of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
You can step down. Thank you. In a few minutes, there will be served lunch out there. But before we go, I have one more question for you in Menti, because as we see down here, Karen is having a lot on her canvas right now, a lot of key points. And now I want you to go to Menti and give your keyword for this first part of the day. A lot of positive words, I think. Thank you so much. Keep them coming. And while you finish this one, I will tell you that after lunch we have 2 breakout sessions. One will take part in this room, and one will take part in the room next door. It's called Norway. The one in here is the one called Building Relevance in Society, and the one in the room next door is Building Relevance in Harm Minimization. That's all, I think. Have a nice lunch out there, and then I will see you 12:45. Thank you.
It's very pleasing to see so many people coming here and putting focus on the important